Atu Quayson nursed a drink in the smoky nightclub, attempting to throttle his impatience. The club was exclusive, a members-only type tucked away in the airport residential area of Accra, Ghana, where the elite liked to see and be seen. His super-elite status meant he was being subjected to far too much of the latter while having zero interest in doing the former. A sigh escaped him as he was forced to acknowledge yet another smile, another wave, and a few suggestive head tilts from stunningly beautiful women who eagerly conveyed the message that they'd gladly end his solitude if he so wished. He didn't like to be rude usually. He had more important things to do in life than withstand his mother's wrath should he ignore some useful politician or heiress's greeting. But he desperately wished his older brother had chosen another venue for this. Whatever it was his brother had summoned him here for. Fifi had sounded almost frenzied on the phone, a state he seemed to be careening closer and closer to recently. Atu's lips thinned. As much as he didn't want to be that guy, he couldn't help but lay the blame for that at the doorstep of the woman his brother had been borderline obsessed with for the last few years. A woman he should have known better than to even look at, never mind date in the first place. Atu Hayford wasn't just extremely high maintenance, she also happened to be the daughter of his family's #1 enemy. Atu couldn't pinpoint exactly when relations between Joseph Quayson and Rex Hayford had turned sour. All he knew was that it had had something to do with a business transaction and had escalated with his family's acquisition of a much-coveted gold mine in the northeast region of Ghana 5 years ago. The one-time best friends had fallen out spectacularly and were now locked in a battle which, owing to the ruthlessness Joseph Quayson possessed, and Atu was fairly sure coursed through his own veins, his family was winning. What he wasn't sure of was whether his father allowed Fifi to date the Hayford daughter, because it was yet another conquest he could silently claim and lord over his enemy. But even if it wasn't, didn't his brother get away with every single transgression he'd ever perpetrated? Wasn't he the golden boy who seemingly could do no wrong? Atu tried to stem his bitterness and jealousy, and his mood plummeted further when he failed to squash them. He was sure he would be in open conflict with his own brother if he didn't love him so much. If he didn't look up to Fifi for his sharp intelligence and his ability to negotiate seemingly impossible deals on the family business's behalf. His brother was a genius. When he applied his total focus to the various needs of the Quayson conglomerate of luxury hotels and resorts mines, and his father's latest venture, a Pan-African private bank. But lately, thanks to Atu Hayford, he'd been operating at a fraction of his capacity. At just a few weeks shy of his 25th birthday, Fifi seemed to have lost all interest in the family business and had spent most of his time pursuing the so-called love of his life. Atu's lips twisted. It was time to stop pulling his punches. Not when he could see his brother traveling down a road that would only lead to disappointment. Because the type of love his brother purported to possess for Atu Hayford simply didn't exist. A firm hand slapping him on the shoulder pulled him from his brooding. But the moment he swiveled his seat and looked up, he wished even more that he hadn't agreed to his brother's request for a drink. Because not only was Atu Hayford in tow, he really should have remembered that these two were all but joined at the hip these days. They'd also brought someone else along. Someone who against his will had the blood rushing through his veins that little bit faster. Amelie Hayford, sister of Atu Hayford, and the woman responsible for far too many of his own forbidden dreams. "You remember Amelie?" Fifi asked. Atu gritted his teeth. How could he forget she'd virtually grown up in his home? Long before their families had disintegrated into bitter enemies, they'd shared twin homes that stood next to each other. They'd gone to the same schools, shared the same friends. Their mothers had been very close friends. Sure. He infused as much boredom into his tone as possible, ignoring the blazing glare Essie leveled his way as her sister flinched at his tone. But fast on the heels of that flinch came a censorious look from Amelie that triggered a bite of regret. He didn't like to be rude, usually. The last time he'd seen Amelie had been around her 17th birthday before she'd left for the UK to attend university. She was shy to the point of being introverted, and Atu had dismissed her almost as soon as he'd clocked just who it was he was being introduced at a friend's party. He hadn't thought of her again until a few weeks ago, when he'd happened to be at the same event as her. Only that time he'd been interested, had wondered who the voluptuous beauty chatting to one of his friends at a garden party was. The roughly 3 years she'd been away had transformed Amelie Hayford. She wore a notable confidence, carried herself in a way that drew second, third, and fourth glances. At least it had that evening, until he'd reminded himself of who she was and what she meant to his family. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that entertaining anything to do with Amelie Hayford was as good as taunting a hungry lion where his father was concerned. Atu wasn't the favored son, and wasn't allowed to do even a fraction of what his brother got away with, no matter what tactic he took with their father. And he'd been taking a few these last couple of years, tactics that had set him on a warpath with his father. What was his brother playing at? "Hello, Atu," Amelie greeted him. Had her voice always been this deliciously husky? Her eyes such large pools of effortless feminine allure. He kept his gaze from traveling down her body. Because he was a gentleman, or didn't want to risk being tempted. Oh, who cared? He tried to shrug it off the same way he'd attempted to dismiss the far too lustful thoughts that continued to plague him. Was that why he was especially testy over his brother's relationship with the older Quayson sister? He frowned. Was he really that twisted? "I didn't realize you'd be here too," he said far too edgily. "Or I wouldn't have come." The unspoken statement lingered in the air between them, and his brother frowned. "I had a table booked for us. Let's move away from the bar." He stopped himself from snapping that he hadn't come to socialize. "So, I've been thinking about a few things Fifi started." Something alarming caught in his gut, and Atu narrowed his eyes at his brother. "Are you about to lay some more of that existential crap on me, Fee? Because it's been a long week, and I'd like at least 3 hours of sleep before I tackle your latest personal crisis." His brother's face tightened, a flash of bleakness dancing across his features before he got his emotions under control. Atu frowned. What was going on with his brother? He glanced to the side where the sisters were chatting in low tones, their heads close together. As if sensing his scrutiny, Amelie slid her gaze towards him, her brown eyes holding his with more boldness than he'd thought her capable of. Why that triggered another blaze in his groin he refused to examine. So the timid girl was growing a backbone, so what? For more reasons than he could count, his interest in Amelie Hayford needed to remain at 0. "I need a break." Atu's gut twisted, and he dragged his gaze from Amelie to focus on his brother. From what? For a tense stretch, Fifi stared into his cognac. From this life, from this place, from everything. "What does that mean exactly?" Atu pressed. Instead of glancing at him, Fee swung his gaze to Essie like a heat-seeking missile, and stayed. She raised her head too, and they stared at one another, speaking in a silent, intimate language that felt almost sacrilegious to watch. "Some things in life are too precious to let them pass you by," his brother said, and despite the increasing volume of the music in the club, Atu heard the words as if they were spoken directly to his soul. Hadn't he said something similar to himself not so long ago? But he'd been saying that because of his position at Quayson Group Hotels about his relationship with his father, not some ethereal emotion that didn't exist. And yet his gaze flicked to Amelie, and he watched as she brought her straw to her lips and sucked in her drink. He was 24 and no longer a hormonal teenager. Things like that shouldn't trigger such base desires in him. But his body fiercely disagreed, rising to attention, snapping awake vicious hungers He seemed powerless to fight. Auraz, was he really that hard up? Sure, he was between girlfriends. The situation between him and his father, leaving no room for the play hard part of his private and professional ethos. More and more, he realized he was being pushed into an impossible situation where his future was concerned. That as much as he loved his brother, he couldn't stay in his shadow. Atu needed more. Tonight, that more seemed to be focused on the woman seated across from him. And unless he was careful, "Are you listening to me?" his brother griped, thankfully severing a dangerous line of thought. Atu shook his head. "Enough. I'm not sure what's going on with you, but maybe let's pick this up when you want to tell me what your plans are regarding the Quayson group, not your personal life." "That's what I thought you brought me here for." The look his brother slid him was almost pitying, and a well of faint dismay opened in his gut. But like before the look disappeared, his brother smiled. "Why did you think I asked you meet? Let me guess. You wanted me to give you tips about how to go up against the old man." Atu shrugged, said nothing. Fifi slapped him on the shoulder. "You don't need tips from me. I think among the three of us, you've got him best sussed. Relax. Stop thinking about the company for 1 minute. You might be surprised at the delights that await you." Before he could scoff at the answer, or better still ask his brother exactly what he meant, Fifi had surged to his feet. Approaching his girlfriend, Fee held out his hand. "Come and dance with me," he stated imperiously. Isi attempted to glare at the insistence in his voice, but was soon smiling, the look reflected in her eyes almost as fiercely possessive as the one Atu had seen in his brother's. A minute later, they were chest to hip on the dance floor, not giving a damn about conforming to the up-tempo beat of the music. "It's all a bit much, isn't it? Being with him makes me feel like the biggest third wheel in existence." Reluctantly, because he most certainly didn't want to test the boundaries of the temptation that ate at him, but compelled to do so, he turned his attention to Amelie. Something ravenous and decadent caught in his chest all over again. "Then why did you come with them?" he growled. Her eyes widened at the bite in his tone, then she shrugged again, surprising him by not cowering. "I'm only here for the summer. I have to grab every opportunity to spend time with my sister before I return to England." She took a sip of her cocktail, then slid her tongue along her lower lip. Her very biteable lower lip. "And seriously, it isn't really as bad as I said." "Yes, it is," he replied a touch grimly. Whatever foolishness his brother had going on with her sister, it was the brazen, in-your-face kind. The kind tinged with melodrama that would have made him roll his eyes and change the channel had he been watching it unfold in a movie. A slow smile curved on Amelie's face, drawing his gaze to her velvet lips and making his body temperature shoot up by several degrees. "Okay, it is, but please don't tell them I said so. Your secret's safe with me," he grunted. "What else do you intend to do while you're home?" he asked, just for something to dilute the effect of that blinding smile. Because he didn't really care. He was simply making conversation. The words rang hollow. The thought of this forbidden girl, no woman, going on a date with someone else grated on him. He reminded himself that she was no longer a girl, that if his memory served him right, she had just celebrated her 20th birthday. "What's it to you?" He almost smiled at her bullshiness. Almost. Because she was distracting him again. With her scent, her lightly made-up face that highlighted the delicateness of her cheekbones, her snub nose, that mouth. "Nothing. It means nothing." "Are you sure?" "Because you seem annoyed by the question, and I can't work out why." "Dance with me." "What?" He shrugged. "We're here. We might as well make something of the evening, no?" He held out his hand, and she took it. He tried to ignore the sizzle of her touch as he led her to the dance floor. The moment he pulled her into his arms, he suspected he'd made a mistake. and yet he carried on swaying with her in his arms, ignoring the warning that he was treading into dangerous waters. She was dancing with Atu Quayson. His invitation hadn't exactly been the fervid invitation she'd dreamed about, but who cared? She hoped he hadn't seen her hand trembling when she slid it into his. How she'd inhaled sharply when his fingers closed firmly over hers. She would have dreamily thought he didn't want to let go of her if he hadn't done so immediately after helping her up his face set in harsh lines, another one of those formidable frowns etched between his eyebrows. She'd wanted to ask why he was bothering to be sociable since he didn't feel even an iota that way inclined. But she kept her mouth shut, the very idea that she was about to dance with Atu Quayson striking her speechless. Her sister's eyebrows shot up when she spotted them, then her face settled into a smug smile. "Go, girl," she mouthed over Fifi's shoulder. If there was one thing Amelie was confident about, it was that she was a good dancer. And the music was infectious enough to lower the high fence of her inhibitions. So she threw herself into him, pumping her arms and twirling her hips until a light sheen of sweat covered her skin. She told herself she didn't care that Atu moved with sublime animal grace but minimal intent. That he'd probably just asked her to dance to be polite. But his gaze seemed riveted on her, almost zealously following her across the dance floor. She wanted him to kiss her. Oh, who was she kidding? She wanted him to do much more than just kiss her. He'd asked her why she'd come here tonight since her sister ignored her when she was with Fifi. The answer she'd given had been true enough. But she'd all but skipped to her room to get dressed when Essie had told her who they were meeting. With the situation between their families, there'd been few pertinent reasons for her to be around the Quaysons. Her sister was different, of course. She'd proclaimed herself in love with Fifi Quayson and practically dared their parents to stand in the way of that love. They hadn't, a feat that still awed Amelie if she were honest. Enough for her to overcome her shyness and tag along tonight, hoping her sister's boldness would rub off on her. She'd almost retreated into herself when Atu had directed those fierce brown eyes at her. But life was too short to be coy about what you want. Wasn't that what her sister had laughingly shouted at her as she thrust the far too short purple dress Amelie wore tonight into her hands? Wasn't that why she'd worn makeup she normally wouldn't? Her lips a slash of bold scarlet that had somehow opened a vein of confidence she didn't know she possessed. She chanced another glance at him. The frown between his eyes said he was fighting demons of his own. Were all the Quayson brothers like this intense to the point of ferociousness? Her gaze flicked towards her sister and Fifi, the inkling that something was going on with them weaving over her senses, momentarily overcoming the sensual fever fizzing in her blood. Shaking the sensation away, but making a note to talk to her sister later, she spun away from Atu, waving at an acquaintance who danced by. The warm breath of the man she'd secretly crushed on since she was in her early teens washed over her neck. It took every scrap of willpower she possessed not to spin around and absorb his very essence. To keep moving, to play it cool, because her instincts warned that easy conquests bored the second Quayson son. "I'll try not to be offended that your attention seems to be elsewhere," Atu stated drolly. She turned slowly, struggling to maintain her composure when his earth and sandalwood scent filled her senses. "What would you do with my attention if you had it?" She didn't know where the brazen question came from, and she held her breath as his eyes narrowed on her. His nostrils flared, and his head dipped a touch closer to hers. Did his pupils dilate a little, or was it her imagination? "You're playing with fire, little girl." "I'm not a little girl," she snapped, ignoring the way his growling voice sent shivers over her body. A sound rumbled from his throat, his words too thick to be coherent, but she suspected he'd murmured, "Don't I know it?" Over his shoulder, she watched her sister and Fee move closer to the DJ's booth. A few words were exchanged, and a different song started a slower, more intoxicating beat that seemed to send a wave of sensuality through the air. The lights in the club dimmed further. Amelie's heartbeat escalated. Before she lost her nerve, she swayed closer, closer, until there was a mere whisper of a breath between them. Brooding eyes scoured her face, an expression weaving over his features that said he was battling something. Before she could decipher it, his hands slid around her waist. He tugged her that last inch, and her chest collided with his. Her sharp breath mingled with the hint of a groan from him. His head lowered a little more, his nose a whisper from her earlobe enough to feel his breath wash over her. She shivered, her hands rising to rest tentatively on his forearms. She'd gone on some light-hearted dates with a few university mates, had been kissed by one or two. While it'd been pleasant enough, nothing this intense had happened to her before. And he hasn't even kissed me. Yet somehow, she knew that when this intensity happened, it would be with Atu Quayson. He'd been the leading man in her every fantasy since she was old enough to register what her hormones meant, and every cell in her body craved it. "Let's get out of here." His breathing was a little ragged, the clench in his face stemming from more than the annoyance he'd felt previously. It took a few seconds for Amelie to decipher what was happening. Atu was aroused by her, then another second to register that her pelvis was grinding into his, the movement almost independent of her will or thoughts. Time suspended in stunned anticipation as they breathed the same air, his eyes settling on her mouth with ravenous intent. When his hand captured her wrist, she fought the urge to sway into his side to experience more of whatever fever was gripping her, gripping them. "Wait, my sister." He flicked a glance at the couple wrapped in a tight clinch on the dance floor, oblivious to anything and anyone but themselves. "Do you think they'll notice?" Feeling a bite of something closely resembling jealously laced with concern, because despite the couple's outwards exhibition of extreme besotting, she couldn't help her instinctual warning that something was wrong. Amelie shook her head. "No, they probably won't." They emerged from the ambient temperature of the club into sultry night air, which did nothing to cool her down. His fingers were still wrapped around her wrist, and she had zero desire to free herself. When he tugged her towards a sleek sports SUV with a distinct Italian logo parked near the entrance, she went willingly. The interior of the car held traces of his scent, and she inhaled greedily as he rounded the hood and slid behind the wheel. He didn't turn on the ignition immediately, merely rested one wrist on the steering wheel as he stared at her. "I'm hungry." She'd been mourning the fact that now they'd left the club, she only had a few minutes with him since her home was 10 minutes away, that he might not even kiss her. Now her senses rekindled to life again. "Me too," she responded, her voice shamefully husky, throbbing with everything she felt. Those devilish eyes gleamed darkly at her, a far too suave smile snatching at his lips before the brooding look returned. "You should refuse this. Reject anything to do with me," he said, with a dark edge that had her gripping her seat. "No one is forcing you to do anything, Atu." He gave a low, arid laugh. "And yet I find myself doing it anyway." She frowned, opened her mouth to ask him to explain, but he was turning on the ignition, the expensive car roaring to throaty life. And because she wasn't ready for the night to end just yet, because she intended to keep ignoring the warnings firing at her, she pressed her lips shut. The view from the top of McCarthy Hill west of Accra was spectacular, second only to the view from the hills surrounding his own home. At the top, Atu had parked at the designated lookout, thankful it was deserted at this time of night. He should have taken her straight home. Instead, he'd seized on the delicate rumbling of her stomach to make an unnecessary detour. The spicy aroma of the chichinga, the thinly sliced roasted meat liberally sprinkled with a concoction of spicy herbs blended with the sweeter scent of Kellowell ripe fried plantain coated in aromatic spices. It was street food at its finest, enjoyed best at night, and one of the things he'd miss most if when he was forced to take the action he suspected was inevitable. He pushed the thoughts from his mind instead, watching Amelie as she speared the soft, spicy plantain with a tiny plastic fork. They'd stopped to buy the Kellowell and meat from a street vendor. Then he'd driven here. Atu didn't know why he'd brought her to his second favorite view in the world. Didn't know why he was here with her in the first place. Why he wished he could show her that secret lookout on Quayson Hills that was his favorite view. The place he withdrew to when the pressure of family and life got a little too much, when butting heads with his father felt like it would tear him apart from the inside, and yet surrendering to what his sire demanded from him felt like a fate worse than death. I haven't had time to have any of this since I've been back. Thank you. Atu! His insides jerked with awareness, the sound of his name on her lips far too enticing to herald anything other than further chaos to him. And in that moment, because he was starved of even a hint of the gentle nurturing he heard in her voice, he wanted to spill every worry, every fear, every aspiration he'd ever harbored. Wanted her to look at him with those soft brown eyes and soothe the chaos inside him. To make promises neither of them would be able to keep. Then he wanted to take her in his arms like he had on the dance floor. But he didn't want to stop at just dancing. He wanted to go further. Perhaps even taste the edges of the fever the Hayford women seemed to trigger. And what was that if not complete and utter foolishness? Our families are at war. Does it not bother you to socialize so blatantly with us? Do you not care that you're causing further friction? A trace of hurt darted across her face, but she shrugged it off in the next instant. Of course I care. You don't think I wish none of this had happened? He pressed his lips together, unwilling to divulge that he wished the same thing too. That perhaps it would have been one less burden to carry. Because what it would have given him permission to lose himself in this woman, the way every fiber of his being seemed to yearn to do. Where have you gone? She murmured again, gentleness in her tone. Nowhere. There's no point wishing for things out of our control. Come, I'll take you home. Disappointment mingled with impatience inside her. Why did you bring me here if you intended to turn around and take me home? You could have put me in a taxi, or instructed one of them to drive me home. She waved her hand at the two SUVs parked at a discreet distance. Billionaires or their sons, like Atu Quayson, didn't travel anywhere in the world without heavy guard. His lips thinned. Maybe I had an ulterior motive. Her pulse jumped, every nerve in her body straining to know what that motive was. Which was, again he stared at her with such ferocity she felt as if she was caught in a cyclone, in danger of being swept away any second. That she wasn't completely terrified was both foolish and entirely too exhilarating. Then he laughed. A bitter, half-mocking, half-self-deprecating sound that ejected her from the decadent sensation coursing through her. I'm not sure whether to be impressed by you or teach you a lesson for your daring. What do you mean? I mean, one of my beloved aunts would probably have a term for what is happening here. I hate riddles. Speak plainly or don't speak at all. Believe me, Amelie, speaking is much better than what I want to do. At least, if I'm talking, I'm safe from whatever spell you're weaving. She gasped. Surely you're not accusing me of casting some sort of spell on you. She scoffed, not sure whether to be thrilled by his gruff confession or offended at the indictment. And while she was vacillating, he made up his mind. He strode purposefully to the passenger door and pulled it open. his gaze fixed on the middle distance as he rasped, "Get in the car, Amelie. Let me take you home. Trust me, you'll thank me for it in the morning." 20 minutes later, they were parked in front of her home, the magic leached from the night. She flung the door open before he could alight to open it for her. Then turning, she lifted her chin, her gaze pinning his. "Just for the record, I won't thank you in the morning. You seem to think you know me better than I know myself." "You don't.